Welcome back for this plenary session, Looking West, 1 year before the US elections, Peril or Promise for the Transatlantic Relationship. 1 year from now, US voters will be heading to the ballot box. And it goes without saying that the United States and Europe are indispensable partners, but of course, with these momentous elections approaching, there are concerns about the US direction of travel after 2024. How will the US elections be impacted by today's security challenges? What role will foreign policy play in the elections? Maybe that's a very short question. How might US foreign policy change after 2024? And as a result, what should the Europeans do to prepare? Now, our panel this afternoon aims to explore the future of the transatlantic relationship in the context of today's challenges, next year's US elections, and the coming geopolitical context. And we have 5 fantastic speakers. 2 are here with us in The Hague, 3 are online in Washington and Chicago. We have Kori from the American Enterprise Institute. Great to see you, Kori. Hi. We have Jeremy Shapiro from ECFR here in The Hague, who's soon to be the director of ECFR's new Washington office. Dina Smeltz online from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Hi, Dina. Stefanie Bolzen from Welt. Hi, Stefanie. Good morning to you. And Sir Julian King here with us in The Hague, formerly, of course, European Commissioner for Security Union, and now, among many other things, with Flint Global. So time is short, and I'm going to dive right in. Kori, from your perspective, how will the 2 wars raging in Europe and the Middle East impact US politics in the short run?
I do think foreign policy will be more consequential, and not just the 2 current wars. I think whoever the Republican candidate is likely to hit President Biden on the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, on giving Ukraine enough aid to keep them fighting, but not enough for them to win. It's hard for me to see how President Biden's personal and very deep commitment to Israel is going to play out. But I will say this is going to be the craziest election since, 1874, maybe, 1878. You're likely to have 4 candidates in the race, 2 that are going to be fringe candidates, but a fringe candidate can turn an American election when the public's this narrowly divided.
And Jeremy, do you agree? And what, I guess, more specifically, how do you think this is going to impact US-European conversations over the coming year?
Well, I never disagree with Kori. It's just too risky. But I would say that, so to agree with her in a different way, I would say that the foreign policy is not going to be a big part of the election. It never is. But what I mean by that, and I think what hopefully she meant by that, was that the specific issues are not, outside of migration, which will be huge, are not issues that people really think about very much or vote on. But there's something very existing on a sort of different plane when it comes to foreign policy in a US election. The public, certainly the president's political people see it this way, and I think the Republican political people see it similarly. They look to the president not for how they're going to do on the war in Ukraine or how they're going to do in the war in Israel precisely, but rather for a sense of protection, for a sense of reassurance, for a sense that American power matters in the world and is respected and can do both well and good. And so that's a sort of leadership quality that transcends any specific issue, but it emerges from the president's performance on all of the specific issues. And that's why, particularly for a Democratic president, they are very wary and afraid of this weakness frame that you can see the Republicans already trying to attach to Biden in the way that, in various ways, they've tried to attach it to every Democratic presidential candidate in the last 30 years or so. And so one of the Republican senators said that they were going to run on an anti-weakness, anti-wokeness platform. And so what the president is trying to do, in part through his policies on Ukraine and Israel, but everywhere, and in part to compensate for Afghanistan, is to sort of project an image of strength, of competence, of reassurance, which isn't about his specific policies. And what the Republicans are going to try to do is portray him as weak on all of these issues. And that's what will matter in the election, not the specifics of a given foreign policy issue. I think that there are a couple of exceptions to that. Migration, I already mentioned, is a huge exception to that. I think one of the things that the president's political people are worried about is that the Gaza war particularly will spill over into some sort of terrorism or violence in the United States, at which point it becomes a domestic issue. And then that certainly could matter directly. But I think broadly it's about this sentiment.
Thank you. And Stefanie, you're the correspondent for Die Welt. You're a German journalist working in Washington. You understand both the German political context as well as U.S. politics. What impact are you seeing of the wars in Ukraine and Israel, Gaza on U.S. politics?
Mm-hmm. Well, it was rather interesting because this week on Tuesday, there were these, among other elections, the election in Virginia. And so I traveled to Virginia, which obviously is not very far from DC. And I just visited polling stations. I was outside trying to talk to voters. And I've done that for 10 years in the UK. So I took the same approach, smiling at people, approaching them. The one thing that I thought was interesting, and this is just an observation, but also tells you a bit about the atmosphere of the coming elections. I had a press badge, and I managed to talk to a lot of Democratic voters, but not one Republican voters, because as soon as they saw the word press, they didn't want to talk to me. So I thought that is also an indication of the atmosphere in the country around media, the upcoming election. On a different level, then also what was interesting there was that people, they didn't want to talk about Ukraine, or obviously it was a regional election, but the things they were voting or they came to vote was school boards. It was about student loans. I mean, there was nobody mentioning foreign policies or Israel or Ukraine. Obviously, again, it was a regional election, but still, I think it's a kind of indicator. And then talking about transatlantic relationship and how already you can see how much the wars in Ukraine and the issue of Israel and Gaza is impacting is, for example, in Congress, where you now have a really very serious row between the new speaker in the House, who last week managed to pass a vote on aid for Israel, but not for Ukraine, while Biden had suggested, as you know, I think 4 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, this massive $105 billion package, which included Ukraine and the border and Israel. And the Republicans are striking this down. So I think this will have really a major impact, because this, the issue of Ukraine and Israel are becoming kind of political score pointing, I think.
And Julian, I mean, again, you understand transatlantic politics. You focused on Europe. You've been European Commissioner for the Security Union. You're of course British. Looking at this broad spectrum of various relationships, as well as the big security challenges that are taking place with Ukraine and now the Middle East, what worries you? What are the things that you are mostly concerned about observing that changing context?
Well, so I'll start just by saying that you're asking us about foreign policy and geopolitics, but there's a whole lot of economic and geoeconomic issues as well, which I think play into Jeremy's point about which will feature in the elections in some way, weakness or wokeness, character, to what extent are you actually sort of soft because you're looking to try and solve problems, particularly on the economic side, through cooperation, as opposed to, super tough, standing up for the US through whatever the opposite of cooperation is, all the way across the spectrum, and we might talk about this, there is a spectrum, to sort of quite hard-headed isolationism. And I think that those issues, as they play into the election and as they come out of the election process, do worry me a bit, because let's, at the risk of hopping ahead a little bit, let's agree that sometimes you can exaggerate the differences between different US administrations on some international issues, geopolitical and geoeconomic. There was, in fact, a degree of continuity between the last Trump administration and this Biden administration on a number of issues, which we might go into. But there are differences. And one of the key differences has been the method, the way you go about trying to achieve objectives. And this administration has been marked by an attempt to do things in cooperation with networks of allies. And the last Trump administration wasn't really marked by that. It was marked by a degree of zero-sum approach to problems. And a future Trump or Trump-style administration, if it pursued that and reinforced that approach, would definitely have big impacts on the way the transatlantic relationship works.
And we'll definitely talk about what a Trump 2.0 would mean for the transatlantic relationship. I mean, this first round, I wanted to get your views because we're all foreign policy people, but actually all four of you have said that foreign policy isn't going to be all that important. And I want to bring in Dina because you've done an extensive set of public opinion polling. What is the US electorate really worried about? Is it sort of Jeremy's weakness and wokeness? Or what are the is it the economy stupid? What are the themes that people are thinking about when they go to the ballot box next year?
Yeah, well, like everybody else has mentioned, foreign policy generally does not really factor into voting decisions. But I think, in a way, the continuation of assistance to Ukraine ties into it because, first of all, the sheer amount of money that the United States, in particular, has given to Ukraine and the military and economic assistance that we've given Ukraine has created some divisions in the electorate, especially among Republicans. Half of Republicans still do support giving financial aid and assistance and also giving military equipment and training to Ukraine. But that has dropped a lot over the course of the last 2 years. Mostly it dropped in the first year and minimally in the second year, but it's dropped a lot from about 70% to now 50%. So I think, and then in terms of our polling, we also see that some Americans, and particularly some Republican supporters, think Europe should be paying more for it. So this idea that some House Republicans have made messaging about the United States is taking its eye off the ball of China and should be kind of focusing more on that. It's focusing too much on Ukraine. And that money that we are giving to Ukraine could be better spent on other issues, including problems at home. So I think that's the way that that economics and Ukraine and Europe can wrap up all together into one kind of factor that might influence votes. But yeah, directly, I don't think there's going to be too much of a foreign policy influence. The one thing that there have been a lot of polls out recently, our poll was conducted before the Hamas attack on October 7th and the war subsequently, but there have been some polls that show younger Americans, particularly Americans of color, are kind of turned off by Biden's full-throated support for Israel. It's hard to say that the alternative candidate would be any less supportive of Israel, but nevertheless, some younger Americans are saying they wouldn't vote for Biden again. So that could possibly be a factor, especially because younger voters really kind of put Biden over the edge in the last election.
And Stefanie, you already mentioned how last week, or when was it? You went to Virginia to caucus a number of voters. You also mentioned that on the Republican side, people weren't really keen to talk to you, but on the Democratic side, they were. Was Europe featured at all in any of the conversations that you had regarding what people are worried about? I mean, this might be a bit of a leading question. I think I know what you're going to say, but still, to what extent in Europe?
Masochistic.
Yeah. To what extent did you get a sense of voters being aware or worried about the transatlantic relationship or European security at all?
None at all. Sorry to say that, but none at all. The conversations I had about Europe was that actually many of the people that I talked to had family or friends in Europe, or had just recently been on summer holiday in Italy. So that was all the European talk I had with voters on Tuesday. But I think there might be some more indirect implications for Europe. And one of those, for example, which has really stayed a bit below the radar recently, is that tensions between Brussels and Washington around steel and aluminium. And there was a deadline back in October, and Ursula von der Leyen was here, and Charles Michel and Josep Borrell. And they came back empty-handed. And for us as journalists, it was frustrating and interesting at the same time. There were absolutely no statements, although back in March when Ursula von der Leyen was here, it was after the IRA disagreement, and Europe was very hopeful that they would find a compromise and memorandums of understanding how European companies would not be disadvantaged because of the IRA. And now it's October and nothing has happened. And one of the explanations is that especially steel is a very politically delicate issue for the president, for Joe Biden, and he doesn't want to be seen to giving away anything to the Europeans that might hurt steel workers in the Rust Belt. So this is one of the implications that is indirect, but you can already see how the election campaign is having an impact on Europe and European business.
Mm. I see you nodding, Julian.
No, I agree. I mean, I think we were starting to say that there were some differences in the way Trump last time, potentially Trump or Trump-style administration in the future, deal with allies and partners compared to the Biden administration. The Biden administration have tried to construct frameworks and discussion platforms for trying to deal with some of these issues. Famously, they've got this Trade and Tech Council that was meant to try and work through some of these issues. They've had a separate dialogue about privacy concerns. That one has worked. This is in contrast to Trump last time, who basically was only interested in Europe as a market. Famously, he got most excited when he was able to sell some extra soya from memory. So that is a different method. But the results sometimes are not so very different, because trying to work some of these very difficult issues, like steel and aluminium, through these frameworks can still not work, and that's what I think we're seeing right now. That the politics, particularly the economic dimension of politics, can get in the way of the best will to try and cooperate.
Yeah, and so Kori, I see you laughing, and I want to bring you in. I want to bring you in as well. Of course, we don't know who the Republican candidate is going to be. I mean,
we got a pretty good idea.
But in your assessment, if it's Biden versus Trump or a Trump-like Republican candidate, what kind of different accents are we likely to expect when it comes to U.S. foreign policy after 2024? Is Biden simply going to be the continuity? Will we see the next 4 years be similar to the previous 4 years? And with Trump, is it going to be, chaos and disaster, as some describe it here in Europe?
Yes and yes. Yes, the Biden administration, you'll see continuity on trade policy because both Donald Trump and Joe Biden are fundamentally protectionists. And so you've seen enormous continuity. But as Dina Smeltz will I hope, expound on, Americans have seldom been as supportive of expanding trade as they are right now. So both political parties are missing an important signal from Americans. And that signal connects to the general anxiety that Americans have about the economy. Even though the economy is objectively doing pretty well, people do not feel great about it. And that's going to be a big drag for President Biden in the election. You're right that a Trump administration is going to be dangerous and chaotic. I think there's simply no doubt about that. The only question is whether Republicans in Congress will be a restraining or an accelerating factor on that. And I think the House will be an accelerant and the Senate will be a restraining factor on it.
And you mentioned Dina, and Dina, could you enlighten us a little bit on what the main sort of U.S. electoral or the U.S. voter outlook is? Well, what are the things that they worry about? How do they see international engagement, or perhaps more broadly, how do you explain the appeal that Trump apparently still seems to have?
Yeah, I'd hung up if I got that question too.
Dina, you're on.
So sorry, I forgot to unmute. Okay.
Sorry.
So first, to piggyback off of what Kori set up for me, thanks, Kori, is that yes, Americans really are very supportive of international trade. Before the Trump years, actually, Republicans were a little bit mixed. Now, even though Trump is out, they've still stayed really pretty high on trade. But at the same time, they do support a lot of trade restrictions, especially when we ask about China. They like kind of like it both ways, especially if any question wording says something about protecting American workers or to prevent rising prices for Americans, then those two kind of factors will influence opinion. But so they do like free trade in general, but they also like protecting their own. So it kind of depends on how it's phrased. Americans in general, well, it's interesting. So Americans overall are really afraid of cyber attacks, and they, both Republicans and Democrats, name political polarization and weakening democracy as one of the top 5 critical threats. However, they blame each other for the weakening democracy and the polarization. So it's not like they have a shared solution for it. And then it kind of divides. The Republicans are really, 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 really concerned about China. 70% of Republicans think China is a threat, but actually now majorities across all, 52% of Democrats and 53% of independents also say China is a critical threat to the United States. So that is one of their top threats. It's a lesser threat for Democrats. Democrats are more concerned about climate change. That's one of their top. And Republicans are super concerned about immigration, and that is way at the bottom of Democrats' concern. So it's kind of a problem when the American public can't agree on what the top threats are to the United States, because then it's very hard to craft policies that are going to get general support, and to know what will make people feel that our national security is strong. So I forget what your other question was. What I wanted actually to talk about was American views of Europe, because there are some interesting shifts, and I think they go along with some of the shifts within the Republican Party, and it's also connected to Ukraine. So the last year, our report was titled "Pivot to Europe," because Americans were really focused on Europe again. Said it was like their top regional locus for caring about U.S. security. But this year, we saw kind of a few drops, not on NATO. Support for NATO is consistent and consistent across party affiliations, but Democrats are much more likely to say U.S. alliances benefit both the United States and its allies. 80% of Democrats say that. It's one of the highest readings ever. Only 50% of Republicans agree. And that's the lowest point ever since 2017. It was 61% in 2019, so now it's 50%. So a big drop there. So as I said, NATO is still pretty constant and consistent support, but it's 92% of Democrats, super high, 68% of Republicans, also high and solid, but a big gap. And it's really interesting because until 1998, Republican support exceeded Democrats, but since 2002, Democrats have been more positive toward NATO. And then there's a lot of partisan, not a lot, but there's some partisan divisions on the use of troops to defend allies. About 2/3 of Americans support defending Germany, and that's across the board if it was attacked by Russia. But now there's a big division on supporting the Baltic NATO allies. 68% of Democrats, but only 48% of Republicans would favor using U.S. troops, and that is a drop for Republicans. So there's a lot of similar declines about support for bases overseas too. We see this kind of drop off of Republican Party support, which kind of mirrors what's going on in the rhetoric among some in the Republican Party. But at a broader level, Americans are less inclined to support active U.S. engagement in the world. It's now 57% say the United States should take an active part in world affairs. That's one of the lowest levels we've ever seen since 1974. It's among the lowest. It's been 57% before, but only like 2 or 3 other times. And that is huge partisan gap now. 70% of Democrats versus 47% of Republicans. And it's the first time ever in our polling that since 1974 that a slim majority of Republicans say we should stay out of world affairs. And I looked then also at Trump Republicans versus non-Trump Republicans, and Trump Republicans are more decidedly wanting to stay out of world affairs. A slim majority of non-Trump Republicans want an active part, but it's really divided. So these are some pretty big shifts we haven't seen in a while, and a lot of it seems to come from the debates around the continuation of Ukraine aid and Americans feeling perhaps overstretched or overburdened by issues abroad versus taking care of problems at home. And also Republicans in particular feel like China should be the higher priority. They think the United States pays too much attention to Ukraine and not enough to China or economic competition with China.
Thank you very much, Dina. I mean, this segues nicely to my question for Jeremy. Jeremy, together with your colleague Maida Ruga, you wrote a piece on the 3 different Republican tribes. Dina's last point about Republican voters tending to prefer or to give greater urgency to the China challenge fits with one of the schools you identified, one of the tribes, the prioritizers. But if you listen to Dina's breakdown, that international engagement is polarized, the NATO membership is polarized, support for defending the Baltic states is polarized. How worried are you then about the direction of U.S. foreign policy moving forward after the elections?
Well, if Trump is elected, I'm very worried. In terms of the tribes are meant to describe the debate within the Republican Party, and to a large degree, the debate within the elites of the Republican Party, the foreign policy thinkers, the congressional people. And there, I think you see that the tribes have, let's say, different bases. The primicists, which is the sort of traditional tribe, who believe in that American foreign policy should be global and focused on leadership, are very, very well represented amongst the Washington, D.C. foreign policy establishment. They dominate still the Republican caucus in the U.S. Congress. They are probably 75, 80% of the Senate, 70, 75% of the the House Representatives still. And so those people obviously have a lot of institutional power, but what they're finding is that that perspective doesn't play well with their voters. It doesn't matter that much to most of them because voters are voting on other things and because they are in safe seats and they don't generally face the powers of incumbency are so great that it's not that they can sort of persist with this gap between them and their voters. But what you're seeing in the presidential primaries is that the primacist view is practically not represented at all. Nikki Haley sort of has it, and she hides it a little bit. The three frontrunners, who, by the way, represent, according to the latest polls, well, I guess they're not, depending on which poll, but they have something like 70 to 80% of the vote, all represent either one of the other two camps. The first is the prioritizers, which reflect Dina's point that Republicans are very worried about China. And these are people who think that U.S. foreign policy should focus very strictly on China and that things like Ukraine and the Middle East are at best a distraction, at worst a Chinese plot to distract you. Mm-hmm. And these people are represented by like Josh Hawley in the U.S. Congress, in the U.S. Senate, but they are, interestingly, they're the sort of smallest set of elite representatives and they have the smallest constituency, but they have a sort of position that exists in the middle and takes in different parts. So there's a very good chance that a future Republican administration would prioritize their foreign policy and just focus on China. But intriguingly, the part that's welling up most from the base and is most represented by the candidates, particularly by Donald Trump, but Vivek Ramaswamy, and depending on where you put DeSantis, perhaps him, is this restrainer position, which basically says we got to focus at home, we got to build American strength. It's categorically not an isolationist position, and I really want to emphasize this. It is about, they definitely believe in American engagement with the world, but they don't believe in things like security commitments, they don't believe in foreign intervention, and they don't believe in things like NATO and the commitments that you'd have to make to allies. And we just did a workshop with a bunch of these Republican thinkers at the Heritage Foundation in Washington last week, and they're absolutely convinced, and I see no reason to contradict them, that they are the future of the Republican base, that they are representing something that the Republican Washington establishment simply doesn't get. That they are tired of these foreign wars, they are tired of these needy allies, and they want people to focus on their jobs and on dealing with the border problems and not on fancy conferences in beautiful halls in the Netherlands.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. And this, yeah.
So the engagement with the world is very much US shaped and driven by US interests and largely sort of bilateral or serial, not through collective discussions, because that just, dilutes.
Broadly speaking, yes. I would say there's some exceptions to that. And maybe a better way of putting it is just that the multilateral engagements have to work for US interests, and if they don't, it's not a religion, you go someplace else. And they will do that when it's necessary. That's their pattern at the WTO, for example, and it will be their pattern everywhere.
So, Kori, you can't see that, but it's raining in the Netherlands, and it's gloomy and gray and dark. And this is sort of the feeling I have having listened to all five of you, because it leads to the obvious question, what does this mean for Europe? What can Europe do to prepare for this new US political context where you either have Biden, but primarily also the darker scenario where you have, as Jeremy described it, a pretty frightening type of US administration, at least one that's very different. So, Kori, what would be your prescription? How does Europe respond to this new post-2024 electoral outcome?
So I do think across the political spectrum in the US, but particularly on the right, there is quite a strong belief that Europe can and should be doing more for itself. And so I think the answer, I mean, my entire professional life, Europeans have been talking about European autonomy and the EU being an independent strategic power. And we have reached the point at which most Americans think, that's great, do it. You know, if Dwight Eisenhower were alive, he would be shocked at the depth of European continued reliance on the United States in security issues. And so I think the answer is the more that Europe does for itself, the more the United States is going to feel comfortable about what we do together. Mm-hmm. I think this is going to play out on Ukraine, in which on the right in the United States, there's going to be a strong push that, hey, we did the war, you guys do the reconstruction. And that's going to be a super unpleasant conversation across the Atlantic. A second thing I think is that, as Dina pointed out, there is bipartisan belief that China is a big problem. And to the extent that the premises in Jeremy's framing get traction, it's that, you know, we are worried that the United States and its Asian allies are insufficient to manage the China problem. And so to the extent that Europeans put shoulder to the wheel and say upholding a rules-based order matters not just in Europe, it matters also in Asia. That's a way for Americans to feel that Europe is less focused on Europe and more focused on what they say, which is upholding the rules and international institutions. You know, the judgment of the court in The Hague about Philippine and Chinese disputes are actually going to loom really large because of the potential for conflict between the Philippines and China right now, and because the United States has a defense commitment to the Philippines. And so we could get a test sooner rather than later on that, and it will cast either a lot of light or a long shadow across the Atlantic how Europe responds.
So Julian, what areas can we strengthen transatlantic cooperation post-2024? Is it Kori's prescription of a division of labor, Europe reconstructs Ukraine, or...
Well, take half a step back, first of all. How do we analyze the risks? There are geopolitical risks. We've touched on some of them. I think there are some quite big geoeconomic risks as well. Some of these are posed to a degree, whether it's Biden 2 or Trump 2. I think on China, we touched on it in the China session, that there could be some tensions where the US are more focused on the rise of China and the Europeans are more focused on their concerns about Chinese behaviors in certain areas. I think that on competitiveness, there'll be different methods. Biden might be a bit softer, but it's going to be very much a US-centric approach to competitiveness and economic issues. I note that under Biden, they haven't done an awful lot to try and keep the WTO going. I mean, Trump might kill it off, but Biden hasn't revived it. And when it comes to differences around energy in the economy and incentives for investment, both under Biden and Trump, those are going to be issues. I think there will be some differences around collective action. And this is where I think you're on something which I think could be quite important. Something like climate. There is going to be a continuing interest in some degree of collective action under a Biden administration. Zero interest, I suspect, under a Trump administration. So there'll be some big geoeconomic issues and some institutions. And we talk a lot about NATO and what might happen to NATO. What about the G7, G20, all the international standards setting bodies? I think those could get hammered under a Trump administration. What do you do about that? Well, if you value those things, those key building blocks of what we call the rules-based international order, then you need to try and find some way of reinsuring them and reinforcing them, maybe to survive, through a chill of a number of years. It's easy to say, extraordinarily difficult to do. And within Europe, I think there are some quite tough questions as well. There's a kind of assumption, an optimistic assumption, which I'd like to share, that if it's a really tough relationship with Trump administration, that the Europeans will do more to hang together. Mm-hmm. I hope that's right. But there's a little bit of evidence from the last time that there can also be, certainly in some areas, some economic areas, some competition for US attention amongst various Europeans. So that would be something I'd be worried about.
Do I observe an element of a British understatement? Stefanie, what can Europeans do to, say, Trump-proof their diplomacy in Washington?
Well, I think they already have a little bit of experience from 2016 to 2020. Just one short comment on following up on what Kori said before about how much the Europeans are really doing. I must say I'm almost astonished by talking to German politicians coming to Washington and then talking in backgrounds about the meetings with the US administrations of the complacency of German politicians saying, oh, well, we have done the Zeitenwende now and everything is fine. And I think picking up on what Julian said, because the Biden administration is rather nice, I wonder whether they don't hear the tones in between. But talking about what Germans, I can only talk about the German side. Interestingly, the Foreign Secretary Annalena Baerbock, she was here in September and she very deliberately traveled to Texas. And she met Republicans, she met Greg Abbott. She also helped the consulate in Houston to open doors. They now have designated that consulate to become an energy and climate hub. So there is a lot going on the state levels. And that's something that the German government is looking into to strengthen actually the relationship between Germany and the states. There is, I think, around 5,400 companies German companies in the US and almost 800,000 jobs. So this is one of the strategies I think that Germany is looking at, strengthening the relationship and showing the significance of good relationships because of jobs, because of investment, and so on and so forth. And that's something that I can see already here is a lot of energy put into these relationships.
Really smart to play at the state level to box in the federal government.
Great. And Jeremy, what are you going to be telling Europeans when you're sitting in your Washington office about how they should prepare for a next US president?
Look, I guess maybe a little bit contrary to Stefanie, I don't really see that there are many illusions in Europe about a Trump 2.0 presidency. I think they know what Trump is, but I think that the reason maybe that she hears that complacency is because they don't know what to do about it. When I was, I remember before the 2016 election, various European leaders, David Cameron, Angela Merkel, were quite outspoken about the dangers that Donald Trump represented to the transatlantic alliance before he'd ever been president, in a very undiplomatic way, a very unusual way. And then the day after he was elected president, you couldn't find these people anymore. They were gone. They disappeared in 24 hours. And all of a sudden, everyone was saying, well, we can work with this guy. There are adults in the room. The U.S. system, the Congress will constrain him. It'll be fine. And I was so puzzled by this that I went out and got an Italian diplomat drunk. It's not that hard. And I asked him, what happened here? Why did you guys do this? And he said, we didn't know what else to do. And the truth is they still don't know what else to do. And there's a couple, even 5 years later. And I think that the reason for this doesn't reside in the specific issues that we've been talking about. It resides in the fact that there isn't any unity within the European Union, or within Europe, or really any capability of deciding what to do in a collective way vis-a-vis the United States. We always talk about European unity on Russia or China or whatever. Actually, European unity on the United States is the hardest thing to get of any of those issues. Every single country in Europe, practically, well, we measured it at one point, it was 14 out of 25 at the time, thinks they have a special relationship with the United States. It's like Lake Wobegon, where all the children are above average. And basically, they deeply value their bilateral relationship. They think that they can get a better deal. When I was at the State Department, I would divide Europe 3 times before lunch. It was easy. It was like falling off a log, and it still is. And any American administration is going to be able to do that. And I think that so the first thing that you would need to do to Trump-proof Europe is for Europe to exist when it comes to America, and currently it does not. I think the other thing to think about when it, well, let me put it to you this way. I think maybe I'll skip that point. We can end there. I've been harsh enough already.
Okay. The weather hasn't gotten any better, neither has my mood. Questions, comments from the room? Floor is harm. Can we get a microphone all the way up front?
Everyone's going to ask what your second point was.
Yeah, I forgot it.
Yeah.
Oh, good version.
Right here, this gentleman. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. Floris Harm, Leiden Asia Center. I was curious for Ms. Smeltzer. You gave a breakdown of attitudes among American public about supporting Ukraine. If push comes to shove, how would that work out? Did you measure the same question with Taiwan? Should that ever be attacked or invaded? And how are attitudes then about supporting Taiwan, like with militarily?
Before you answer, Dina, let's see if we can get one other question in. All the way at the back, the gentleman with his hand raised. Yeah. So.
Hi, Luke from LSE. I wanted to ask the panel about hypothetical opinion polling. I hope that's not annoying. But I noticed that when a Republican moderate stands independently as a third-party candidate with running against Biden and Trump, there's this interesting tendency for the moderate candidate to take more from Biden than to take from Trump, and therefore like defeating the whole idea. Does that indicate the breadth of Biden's support or the homogeneity of Trump's support, or both, or neither?
Let's ask Dina to touch on both those questions. So the issue of Taiwan, to what extent does it come up in your public opinion polling, and hypothetical modeling, and let me throw in the footnote that what impact would a third candidate, an independent, have on the outcome of the elections?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so I would say, so on Taiwan, yes, we have asked it. Americans are generally, so they feel very threatened by China on a number of levels, but they don't want to get into a military confrontation with China. There's been some recent polling by National Security Action and Foreign Policy for America. They distinctly came out with that. Our surveys show about 4 in 10 Americans say they would support U.S. troops defending Taiwan if it's invaded by China. So majority oppose it, but 4 in 10 is a sizable number if it's not a live conflict. So it's not a bad number to start with, but they generally do want to stay away from any kind of conflict with China. We also asked about, would you support sending U.S. troops to defend, to take Japan side in a dispute over some territories. If China claimed part of the Japanese also claimed the territories, and a majority also opposed that too. So definitely want to stay away from kind of military confrontation. On the third party question, I think the reason the numbers drop away from Biden, not so much Trump, is yes, there is a homogeneity in terms of Trump supporters. There's also, they are really enthusiastic about Trump, like very strong supporters. And there's less enthusiastic support for Biden. There's been poll after poll showing Democrats in particular are very uncomfortable with his age. So I think you see that playing out. And third party candidates don't usually make it very far, but they can definitely impact an election, especially when the margin's really thin between the two candidates. Ross Perot was one who was pretty successful in derailing votes. When was that, 92, Kori? Yeah, but basically, I think it comes to the strength of the support for a particular candidate. And I don't know that people who really, really, really support Trump, I don't know that they're so much on the issues as just the personality and the kind of overarching ideas that Trump puts forth, and protectionism and doing more in the United States versus outside the United States, those kinds of things.
Thank you, Dina. Kori, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I do think as usual, Dina is right. The only thing I would add is that I do think a big part of our disgraced former president's appeal is the sense that, government is so large and so distant and so difficult to influence that having somebody fighting for you is a big part of Trump's appeal. And the Chicago Council polling in 16, 17, and 18 demonstrated the fact that people favored Trump's overarching ideas, but really disliked the policies that implement them. And so that's turbulence in the system as well.
And Jeremy?
Yeah. Look, I mean, one of the things that's interesting about both the 2016 and 2020 elections is that there have been like a huge number of theories about what made the difference. Black voters didn't turn out in Detroit in 2016. Left-handed Jewish voters in Madison, Wisconsin turned out in droves in 2020. And I think one of the things that's interesting about those theories from both those elections is that all of them are correct. And what that reflects is not the brilliance of political analysis. It reflects the fact that the elections were so close that actually from a sort of scientific perspective, they were kind of random events. And if you'd run them the next week, they might have come out differently. They depended on things like, the weather, a butterfly flapping its wings off the coast of Africa, whatever. And so a third-party candidate can certainly play into that thing. I mean, it's got to be correct, right? I mean, if they're never going to get more than 1 or 2% of the vote, but that would be enough in key states to turn the election, and that is what happened in 2016, and that was one of the theories that was correct. But I think to sort of focus on that stuff misses the broader dynamic of what's going on. The broader dynamic of what's going on is that for reasons that have to do both with the trends in the country and the sort of efficacy of the country of the parties at locating the center of the electorate, this is going to be the third straight deeply close election. We already know roughly how 42 or 44 of the states are going to vote. We already know who the candidates are. We know how 95% of America is going to vote. What we don't know really is who is going to turn out, who is going to vote. And I mean, this is a slight exaggeration, but only slight. And what that means is that this is fundamentally a mobilization election. Yeah. And the last two have been too. And that is really where, if you're sort of analyzing the thing, that's where you should be focusing your energy. Is what is it that will inspire the voters on both sides? It's quite different. Dina mentioned that the Trump voters are much more enthusiastic than the Biden voters. I think that's really a very, very important thing to be keeping your eye on. But also to notice that in the previous two elections, the Democratic candidate hasn't been the one that has been turning out either Republicans or Democrats. And that Trump, for all of his many sins, is a turnout machine for both parties. And what the Biden people will be doing, unusually for an incumbent, is trying to make the election about Trump for that reason. And what Trump will be doing, because he's an unbelievable narcissist, is also trying to make the election about Trump. So that is the dynamic that's going to play over the next year, and that's going to be what determines the relative mobilization more than any other factor.
Thank you very much for that. I think we have time for one final question. If not, I'm going to ask our two Europeans on the panel to give us their closing thoughts on what we should do in the 364 days up until the next election to prepare for whatever comes after. Ladies first, Stefanie, how can we prepare ourselves for that whirlwind that might come?
I mean, in what I said before, this kind of complacency of especially German representatives of the German government, I hope it's not what they're saying in the backgrounds. It's not really what they are going to practice. That's what I hope is going to happen. In terms of the election, I mean, picking up what Jeremy just said, one of the things I detected now in Virginia on the ground with the voters, that the lack of confidence in government is not limited only to Republicans, but also very much to Democrats. And I could really feel the anger among Democrats that their candidate is Joe Biden. And that has been actually the talk of town in the last days, that in the end, if there are successes now, like the abortion referendum in Ohio and also in Virginia, the election, it's not down to Biden, but it's down to Democratic activists. And that there might be a push, actually, that at the end of the day in November 2024, we might not see Biden and Trump to be the candidates. So I think we could mentally also should start preparing that it will be a completely different race. This is one of the theories, but I think there's so much to look forward to because so many things can still change.
Yeah. Thank you. And Julian, final thoughts?
Well, fingers crossed. But attempts from the outside to influence elections usually don't work very well.
The Russians tried.
Legitimate attempts from the outside to try and influence elections, or indeed referendums, doesn't work that well. So I'm not sure there's an awful lot, we in Europe can do that's going to really affect the vote and the factors that have been discussed.
I feel like you're just one Guardian writing campaign away from getting this thing done.
Yeah, quite. But I do think that because it's pretty close and hard to call, getting ready for either scenario would be a good idea. So talking about it a bit more. It's surprising how little it is discussed, partly because people are a bit scared, partly because, as I think we may have inadvertently proven, it's quite difficult to come up with any great winning ideas about what you do. But I don't think that should stop us talking about it and trying to work out whether there are some things that we could do to reinforce some of the organizations and mechanisms that we work with and that we want to see continue, even if they may well not prosper under a Trump 2 administration.
Yeah. let me underline that final point, that at least the least we can do is to generate awareness and a sense of discussion and create a discussion that this is coming Europe's way, that Europe should be prepared. Think about the scenarios, how to prepare for any contingency, because that's the least that we can. That's the least that we can do. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I would like to invite you to join me in thanking our panelists. This has been a very brief conversation on a very big topic. There is a lot to say about the future of the transatlantic relationship and a lot to say yet on the US elections. We only touched on, I think, a couple of nodes, but please join me in thanking our speakers, and we'll definitely continue to focus on this topic in the months to come.